Hey everybody. So as promised, I wanted to take this video and spend a bit of time talking about what it's like to write a novel. And there's a few different things I wanted to touch on here, but I thought I'd start off by way of comparison, which is why I've decided to show you guys some footage of Power Grids, which for those of you who don't know is an iOS game that I wrote and released on the App Store back in 2011. So, Power Grid started life as a Flash game that I had written for a website that some of you might recall called Gaming's Edge back in 2005. It lived there for quite some time and actually built up a little bit of a following and a fan base of people who frequently visited the site. And so, whenever I was first in the process of learning Objective-C and the iOS SDK and various other mobile development related technologies, it seemed like a natural fit to bring that project over to that platform. Now, I bring all of this up here because I think there's a pretty interesting comparison between the experience of creating a game like Power Grids and writing a novel. And I think one of the most interesting things to consider in that comparison is the idea that, to a certain extent, especially these days, software is never really finished. From the time that I released Power Grids on iOS, I had to update it 3 times to address various changes and alterations that Apple made to iOS and the way that native applications function on it, dealing with things like global user interface changes and changes to screen rotation triggers and such. So, for me personally, one of the coolest and most compelling things about writing a novel versus creating a game or writing some other piece of software is the fact that, for the most part, the novel is an entity unto itself. It's not dependent on some other piece of technology or some other component to function properly. To be sure, especially when you talk about ebooks and digital distribution methods for novels, there are some technical aspects to that process that kind of complicate it a bit. But at the end of the day, one of the nice things about writing in the traditional sense versus software development is that the work that you create persists and continues and is, for the most part, generally speaking, stable. When I hold the paperback of my first novel in my hand, I get a sense of permanence and a sense of completion from it that I've rarely, if ever, felt in my many years as a software engineer. Now, of course, having said all that, there are certain benefits and pros to software, and in particular game development, that are worth noting, such as the ability to create something in a way that's very compelling in its own right. And I'm not really trying to suggest here that one method of artistic expression is somehow better or more interesting or more valid than the other. I more so just find it interesting to note the differences between those experiences and the particular way that writing a novel made me feel versus the experiences that I've had as a software developer. I imagine that one really big curiosity that a lot of people have who bothered to click on this video and watch it to this point is the question of what it actually feels like to write a novel. And I've actually been through that process 3 times now. Those of you who are familiar with the channel no doubt know about my first published novel, The Big Men, and the fact that I've been actively working on a new novel ever since then. But what a lot of you might not know is that The Big Men wasn't actually my first novel. Over 20 years ago, I wrote an unpublished science fiction novel, which was my first real attempt at such a thing. And while that project will most likely never see the light of day, I do think it's an interesting and noteworthy milestone along my path as a writer, because I often think that had I not made that attempt in the past and learned all of the various things I did from that experience, it's entirely possible that I may not have been able to progress to the point that I have reached as a writer today. One thing that I would say for sure is that the more I thought about this topic in anticipation of making this video, the more I realized that there is no one single universal answer to that question. To a large extent, that's going to vary and differ from person to person, and what one person finds compelling or interesting or motivating about the process is not necessarily going to be the same for someone else. But from my own perspective, I've consistently found the simple act of creation to be a very potent and motivating and satisfying endeavor. And one of the things that I would say, having been through the process of writing a novel a few times now, is that it's the anticipation of that sense of fulfillment that largely motivates me. There have definitely been times during all three of my novel length writing projects where I felt myself on the verge of stalling out or on the verge of kind of running out of steam or feeling overwhelmed by the sheer scope and magnitude of the task. But I think one thing that's worth sharing about that experience is reassuring anyone who's considering undertaking something like that, that at least as far as I'm concerned, the rewards and the benefits of completing that process and actually seeing it through are really significant and worthwhile. Writing a novel is most certainly not all sunshine and rainbows, and I don't mean to in any way diminish or trivialize any of the struggles involved in it, but I feel much like any other significant commitment or endeavor in life, writing a novel is a quite complex and varied experience that's certainly been among the most significant and worthwhile that I've had. Having said all that, I hope you folks have enjoyed this video. This one definitely took quite a bit of thought and time and effort to put together. And to be honest with you, I'm still not entirely certain that I hit on or conveyed everything that I wanted to in just the right fashion. But there's really no reason why I can't expand on this topic in a future video at some point. And I really just wanted to get something out there and get the channel back in gear as it's been a little while since my last posting. It's still my intention to do another video talking specifically about the editing and pre-production process that gets applied to an initial draft of a novel before publication. But I don't necessarily want to commit to exactly when that video is going to happen, as I'm currently in the midst of that process for the new novel, and it's a bit unclear as to how long it's actually going to take. And my general sense is that even once I've completed that process, I'm going to want to let some time pass before I try to tackle that subject in a video like this. The good news is that I will still be creating and publishing some writing related videos here in the not too distant future as I officially announce and talk about my new novel, which is very rapidly approaching the point where it makes sense to start working on that content. So if you're curious about that or just generally interested in this sort of subject matter, be sure to subscribe and stick around for those upcoming releases. I'm also planning to do a more traditional channel update here shortly to bring everybody up to speed on what's going to be happening on the channel once the bulk of the work on the new novel is complete, as that's going to allow me to shift gears a bit and potentially get into creating some content that's a little more traditional for long-term fans of the channel. So look forward to that as well. It's definitely my goal to not let quite as much time pass between this video and the next one I release, but I really felt it was necessary to give this particular topic a sufficient amount of time to percolate in my noggin before trying to present it to you folks. With all that said, I'm going to bring this particular video to a close, and I will see you next time.